Howdy, everybody. Thanks for joining us here at Keto Salt Lake Virtual. Gee, has anything been happening since the last time we got together? Well, I don't know about you, but I've been spending a little time thinking about some things. One of them is livestock agriculture and animal source food from a global perspective. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that today. One of the organizations that I've gotten to know a little bit is the International Livestock Research Institute, abbreviated ILRI. They're located outside Nairobi, Kenya, and their slogan is Better Lives Through Livestock. And I really like that, in part because I think it pushes back against some narratives that we're being subjected to. But I've been thinking about that, and I'm going to kind of change it to Lifestock, which is the title of the presentation. In part because I think livestock agriculture, animal source food is so absolutely essential for human flourishing and proper development and health. And it's a global issue. And I think there's some things that we could learn from what's going on in other countries, vice versa, as well as we need to be aware about how what we do in the high income countries affects people in low and middle income countries. Yes, of course, my primary interest as the sod father is in ruminant animals and their essential role in humanity's past, present, and future. But we're going to be kind of ecumenical in this one when it comes to the food, but I'll focus a little bit on the ruminants when that's appropriate. For those who don't know who I am, hey, I'm Peter Ballerstedt. I'm a forage agronomist, ruminant nutritionist. I'm an advocate for therapeutic carbohydrate reduction and ruminant animal agriculture. I've worked in forage agriculture for most of my adult life, and I currently work for a forage seed company, but I'm not here acting as a representative of that company, just a private person today. So my training as a forage agronomist taught me about healthy soils and healthy plants. And then as a ruminant nutritionist, I learned about those things that give us healthy animals. A lot of nutrition courses. And of course, there's relationships between those. And like many in the therapeutic carbohydrate reduction slash keto slash related fields, I had my own personal health journey. You could call it a Christmas story. So 2007, set up the camera on the tripod, hit the timer, jump back in to get the picture. Yeah. So I realized I was a 51-year-old balding, obese, pre-diabetic. 3 years later, thanks to information available from people like Doctors Michael and Mary Dan Eads, Protein Power Life Plan, many others, all I was balding. And I remain balding today. It's not a miracle, but I'm no longer obese. I'm no longer pre-diabetic. So in addition to my formal training and experience, I could then bring in my personal experience and my informal research in terms of healthy people to complete the circle. And yes, there's this interrelations amongst all of these. And so I started about 10 years ago writing and talking about something I call grass-based health to bring it all under that umbrella. And I started showing up at different events, and sometimes I just attended and sometimes I got to be part of the program. Frequently the questions that were asked were, what's a forage agronomist? And then, so what are you doing here? And what that gave me the opportunity to do was to teach people about ruminants and ruminant animal agriculture. And it also taught me that producers and consumers alike care about the same things. We just understand them differently because of our experience, because of what we've learned. And so I hope that I can be a bridge builder and span the gaps between producers and consumers, between different disciplines. Really want to avoid the us and them and the diet wars. But at some point, we just have to face facts, and you are entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts, as Senator Moynihan said. So let's look for places that we can agree. Let's focus on achieving adequate essential nutrition and attaining, or even better, maintaining metabolic health. I understand there's a lot there to talk about, but if we can't agree that those are goals, then we probably have some issues that we need to work out before we have any sincere conversation. And then based on the understanding that we gain from adequate essential nutrition and metabolic health maintenance or restoration, then people should be free to choose based on their preference, based on their situation, on their personal responses. It's not one size fits all, but we need to make sure people get the information. It's been my experience that most people haven't been getting that information. Came across this quote the other day, really like it. We won't tell you what to eat, drink, or wear, but it is good to hear the two sides of the story about livestock, because when you make a choice, you also choose all the consequences. Hard for me to imagine people can make informed decisions when they're lacking so much information. We do have challenges ahead of us. I'm given the opportunity every once in a while to talk to undergraduate classes, and I realize that 2050 is their professional lifetime still. And the projections are that by that time, world population will reach 9+ billion people, which will require a doubling of world food production. Now, reducing food waste is going to be a critical part of that, but clearly more food needs to be produced to feed more people. And the projection is that there's going to be a 2/3 increase in demand for animal protein. I'm willing to argue that that's a dramatic underestimate, but I didn't, publish it, so there you go. And of course, this food must come from the virtually the same land area and also oceans as today. At the same time, we're losing our arable topsoil at a pretty significant rate globally. We're going to have to double electrical generating capacity by that time to meet the needs required for development in the low and middle income countries. So as we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, for example, this is going to be a significant issue. We'll see some figures in a little bit. 70% of humanity globally will then be living in urban areas mid-century. So food's got to be produced somewhere and moved somehow to the population where it will be consumed. And then, of course, we're faced with the nutrient transfer, to be kind, somewhere else. And we'll get into that just a little bit. At the same time, we have this narrative that somehow we can have a future without animal agriculture, without animal source food, when animal source food is fundamental to sustainable development. We have no hope of feeding today's world, let alone the world of 2050, without ruminant animal agriculture as a fundamental part of whatever agricultural systems are practiced in whatever part of the world they're being practiced. They're going to look different. There'll be different species involved, but it's just the reality. Again, these are facts. But the good news that I want more people to be aware of is that we can have healthy people and healthy soils thanks to ruminant animal agriculture. The bad news is that we can't have healthy people without healthy soils. And again, animal source foods are essential for human development, and flourishing. Livestock source foods are important if the global nutritional, educational, and economic needs are to be met and can be used to feed developing countries out of poverty. I love that phrase, feeding developing countries out of poverty. And again, I've been getting introduced to a number of people who are working across this space. There's some challenges there, though, I want to get into. Again, animal source foods contain unique nutrients. They're the only dietary source of several essential nutrients. Even when they're providing nutrients that plants arguably could, they're coming in a much more bioavailable form. So for example, zinc. They're superior sources of protein in that they're the complete amino acid profile and highly digestible. They're the only source of EPA and DHA, except for sea vegetables, but how many people are eating them? Unique bioactive compounds are provided. This is just a short list. We're learning more. And when we compare animals to animal source to plant source foods, it shouldn't be a surprise to this audience that if I feed the same energy calories from animal source foods and plant source foods, the person we're feeding isn't going to have the same metabolic response, right? Energy coming from natural fats versus energy coming from sugar and starch. If I could concoct a diet that had the same amount of protein, and I should have put quotes around it, and minerals in a plant only and an animal source only diet, they're not going to have the same metabolic effect. And it turns out that our vitamin requirement is highly dependent on the dietary source, so that if it's a high carbohydrate diet, we're going to need more vitamins. So they're not equal, but yet too often they're treated as if they are interchangeable, replaceable. Animal source foods are superior to plant source foods as sources of the amino acids and other essential nutrients humans require for proper development and health. This is only controversial outside of the disciplines. They'll even say things, but they'll hide it in footnotes, and it's really quite frustrating at times. Again, should not be controversial. For those people who say that humanity needs to be on a plant-based or plant-forward or plant-only, whatever the euphemism is, diet, the reality is humanity's diet is already plant-based. The majority of calories in humanity's diet are coming from plants. And globally and in the developing world, the majority of protein, put quotes around it, is coming from plant sources. Maybe that's the problem. So here in the US, almost 60% of our calories come from grains, added plant lipids, and added sugars and sweeteners. Pretty sure that's a problem. So let's just ask the question, when it comes to the consumption of animal source foods, is there such a thing as too little? Well, yeah, there's very high quality evidence of the harm that's being done to human beings because, for whatever reason, they're not getting enough animal source food in their diet. This is a complex issue. It's not as simple as animal science 201 and forage crops 301 and soil science 101. There's a lot of things in here, but we got to get some dietary stuff sorted so that it's not making it harder to get this stuff sorted. So globally, nearly 1 in 4 children under 5 are stunted. This is not merely stature. This is also cognitive development, and it's a lifetime decrement. Stunted mothers are more likely to have stunted children. 2 billion people in the world out of 7 suffer from micronutrient malnutrition. A diet that's low in animal source food typically results in low intakes of bioavailable iron and zinc, calcium, retinol, vitamin B2, B6, and B12. This is from FAO and WHO. This is not controversial. What are we being told we need to eat? Oh, diets that are high in grain, that are deficient in these essential nutrients. So maybe it's not a surprise. There's a lot of work now, people looking at what they say the first 1,000 days of a human being's life. The reality today, though, is that a third of women globally of childbearing age are anemic. Vitamin B12 deficiency is widespread across low, middle, and high-income countries. Only 40% of infants under 6 months are exclusively breastfed, which means they're not getting the essential nutrition that they need because many of these are being fed a plant-based replacement formula. And if a woman's body stores of B12 and other essential nutrients is low because she's not well nourished, she can't transfer those either to the developing infant in utero or through her breast milk. Major issue. First 1,000 days, animal source foods are the best sources of high quality nutrients for children 6 to 23 months of age. Again, this is WHO. Yet 59% of children globally in that age group are not fed eggs, dairy, fish, or meat. And these researchers have looked at the rate of stunting and related it to the annual consumption of meat in various countries. And no, association doesn't prove causation, but it's pretty clear that the lower the meat consumption, the higher the rate of stunting. I can't help myself. Here's what one organization has recommended for their planetary diet. Yeah, no, I don't think so. And here's something interesting. For those people who are thinking that the world can do well on a cereal and nut and legume diet, stunting has been linked with the ingestion of aflatoxin contaminated cereals and nuts, which contribute to stunting through suppression of the immune system, increasing risk of infection, and interference with micronutrient metabolism in the liver. So when we have these commodities that are not stored properly, maybe they're not harvested at the right moisture, yeah. So better lives through livestock. It's not just up to 23 months. Researchers have demonstrated improvement by adding meat to the existing diet of school children in various countries and documented improvement in scholastic performance and in interaction and leadership testing. And we're learning that as we age, we need a higher plane of nutrition for a number of reasons. So higher quality diet is essential for seniors and old farts like me so that we might age in a more healthy manner. So when it comes to the consumption of animal source food, there is such a thing as too little. Is there really such a thing as too much? Why do we think there is? Well, claims about the health dangers of red meat are not only improbable in the light of our evolutionary history, they are far from being supported by robust scientific evidence. When I talk to people who are in animal nutrition or veterinary medicine, it's hard for them to really wrap their minds around just how bad or poorly based, to be more charitable, human nutrition and human medicine is. The simple fact is that human nutrition and medicine cannot obtain the answers that animal nutrition and veterinary medicine can. Ethical considerations just being one, logistics being another, cost being another. So they've relied on something called nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease. And virtually everything that ever comes out that says meat is bad is based on these kinds of surveys. We're all familiar with why these have been termed mythology. Questionnaire-based guesses, nothing's measured, so there's no real data. Might not be a surprise then that when the claims from such studies are subjected to clinical trials, they fail at least 80% of the time. And if you remember the kerfuffle, or is it kerfluffle, that happened after the Annals of Internal Medicine papers in, was it 2019? Basically, these people were twitching, and as this paper said, some of the researchers have built their careers on nutritional epidemiology. I can understand it's upsetting when the limitations of your work are uncovered and discussed in the open. But that shouldn't be the basis of public policy or dietary recommendations, and yet it is. And we also need to acknowledge the conflict of interest that's been inherent in dietary guidelines and recommendations for the last half century and beyond. Mean no disrespect for people of faith, but I think it should at least be declared as a potential conflict of interest. From reading Gary Taubes, I became aware of a phrase, double burden of malnutrition, where you see coexistence of undernutrition and overweight and obesity in the same households even, but certainly in the same populations. This poses a problem for people who think that overweight and obesity is the result of overeating or sedentary behavior. But it's a term and it's used, and well, but now I'm coming across the phrase, the triple burden of malnutrition. So we have underweight, this undernutrition, which they associate with underweight, stunted, wasting, micronutrient deficiency, and overweight and obesity. Again, this realm is heavily contaminated with a conventional wisdom in terms of what causes overweight and obesity. And it's my hope that we can form relationships and projects that will allow us to examine how this triple burden of malnutrition is actually all malnutrition. It's all metabolic illness, from overt lack, and then how the lack of specific nutrients might influence ingestive behavior, and how if you're eating a nutrient poor carbohydrate based diet, you might eat more and get more calories and trigger all the issues of metabolic illness. My statement is that the preponderance of high quality evidence from all scientific disciplines strongly suggests that the most likely harm associated with animal source food consumption is from not consuming enough. I can hear people say, what do you know? You're just a forage agronomist. Well, ignoring for a moment the slight of just, yeah, it's a fair point. But even a forage agronomist understands the difference between protein and crude protein. And I've been surprised by how many people don't understand that when they see statements about global protein supply or protein intake, that they're reporting crude protein, not true protein. What's a scandal here is that globally, humanity gets more of its protein, in quote, supply from cereals than from all animal source foods. And wheat is the single largest contributor to humanity's crude protein supply. That needs to be fixed. If you live and you're poor in the tropical portions of the world, rice provides more crude protein per person than beans, meat, or milk, and yet it's a really bad protein supply. It's very limited in digestibility and content. Don't just think that this is something that happens in low and middle income countries. Over 40% of Americans don't get enough protein. Again, crude protein. Most females over the age of 8 aren't getting enough. It's worse than this because, as I've mentioned, it's crude protein and they're driving towards a really low target. So it's even worse than this. In the US, this is NHANES data. This was published in the 2015 scientific report of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. Somehow they were able to say that protein wasn't a nutrient of concern. Even a forage agronomist, forage agronomists have spent a lot of time looking at testing forages because we understand that hay and silage and even pasture herbage can vary tremendously in its nutrient content, its digestibility. Same thing happens with all plant source foods. Just to take soybeans for an example, their crude protein value can vary by 20%. This is based on 6,000 samples virtually. Individual amino acids can vary by as much as 45% around the mean value that's listed. Now, when they create some food-like substance using these plant source commodities, they don't print a new label for every batch. So people think that they're getting nutrition, but they really don't even have any idea of what they are or aren't getting. If you'd like to learn more on this topic, I posted a presentation on YouTube. You can find it, When is Protein Not Protein? But this is also important when we start having environmental conversations, because too often they'll talk about yield of crude protein from plant sources and compare it to what could be obtained from animal sources. It's just not a fair comparison. It's not accurate. Here's another one. We've all probably heard about phytate. Well, it's the major storage form of phosphorus in plants. They suggest even that it's a storage of trace minerals in plants. Constitutes 60 to 80% of total phosphorus in cereals, legumes, nuts, and oilseeds. Oh, it's not bioavailable to non-ruminant animals. That could be a problem. So people who are doing good work, honest work in sustainable research, understand that any conversation about sustainability has to look at societal and economic factors as well as environmental. I mentioned the threat of loss of arable soils. There's no adaptation to loss of topsoil. When that's gone, game over. And yet it is on a trajectory to be a more serious problem than the worst case scenarios that are sometimes said for climate change. We're limited by what we can use to produce food. So of the land area, which is something like a third of the Earth's surface, only a third of that can be used to produce food. A quarter of that is in perennial forage and rangeland. Only 12% is in cultivated crops. And that can sometimes include short-term forages. One of the problems with either or thinking is it ignores the fact that there is no plant source agriculture without animal source agriculture. They're thoroughly integrated. So ruminants are essential to sustainable food systems. They upcycle nutrients. They take them from a form that may be less available to us or unavailable to us, and they increase their value nutritionally for us. They're a source of income. Over half of the fertilizer that's used to grow crops in the world comes from manure. A large part of that is from ruminants. Over half of the world's farmers still depend on draft animals for traction, and a significant number of those animals are ruminants. The ruminants are providing ecosystem services, grassland health, non-food resources from the beef animals or other ruminants, as well as wildlife benefits from properly managed grasslands, water quality benefits from properly managed grasslands. There's a long string of ecosystem services, benefits to society for which the farmer is not presently paid. Unfortunately, we also live in a world where too many people are still dependent on burning dirty biofuels. And the manure ruminants is one of those fuels. When you do, you create a tremendous amount of indoor particulate air pollution, which has a detrimental effect on respiratory health for women and infants. Also, you lose the fertility that was in the manure. Again, no sustainable food systems without livestock. At least half of the cereals in the world are being produced on mixed farming systems where the animals are in that farm system. And a significant, almost half of the supply of major crops is coming from smallholders in especially low and middle income countries. And here's the future. Learning how to integrate better the livestock cropping systems. And this is one paper that came out last year where they discovered that they could produce more land, more food from the same land with the same or lower inputs and improve soil health at the same time. A quadruple win. So cattle contribute directly to global food security. Unfortunately, the conversation tends to devolve and only look at one issue, which is anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And it is true that if we look globally, almost a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. But don't let them assign all that to livestock. Approximately 14.5% is coming from livestock. And don't let them give all that to beef. Only 6% of the global total is coming from beef cattle production. The US beef cattle production contributes less than 0.5% of the global total. And yet they're 8% of the global beef cattle, and they're producing almost 20% of global beef. And we need to recognize that the increase in enteric methane production, that is the burps, from all domesticated ruminants is coming from the developing nations, not from the US, which has been virtually flat since the early 60s, and not from the other industrialized nations, which has been declining since the 60s. Sorry, the 70s. If we shift and look at US emissions, all of agriculture, forestry, and land use accounts for approximately 10%. But that sector is the only one that's sequestering carbon. And today, the sequestration within that industry group more than offsets the emissions from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So if we're talking about an essential service to society in the sense of food and the food that we require, and then we can look at these other industries, and in fact, we have to look at the other industries as places to make meaningful reductions while we're improving our farming systems. There's still improvements to be done. But I want to make sure that we understand where we're starting from. And just in case it comes up, if you could eliminate animal agriculture in the United States, you can't, but just entertaining the notion. The potential benefit in terms of greenhouse gas reduction would be less than 3% in the US and less than 0.4% globally. But it would come at the cost of unbalancing our food ecosystem and creating essential dietary nutrient deficiencies. That doesn't sound like a good strategy to me. How about another approach? See, metabolic illness, chronic illness has an environmental impact. Let's just look at type 2 diabetes, for example. The average American with type 2 diabetes uses pharmaceuticals that are equal to 2 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. If the average American diabetic could eliminate their medication use, is such a thing even possible? How could you do that? They would reduce their personal CO2 equivalent, so-called carbon footprint, 29% more than if they switched from a high meat to a vegan diet. One thing we know about a low carb, high fat, keto diet is it's sustainable. People can stay on it. What about a vegan diet? If the total population of type 2 diabetics in the United States, adults, if their use of those diabetic-specific pharmaceuticals was eliminated, it could result in a reduction of almost 50 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. That's the equivalent to the carbon sequestered by more than 65 million acres of forests in 1 year. So big number, what does it mean? It's the area of forest would be the 9th largest state in the United States between Colorado and Oregon. It would be the 76th largest country in land area, larger than the United Kingdom. And that's just, air quotes, type 2 diabetes. We understand that type 2 diabetes is metabolic disorder. We understand its insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. And we understand that those also play a part in these other diseases. Diabetes is the 7th leading cause of death in the United States. What percent of the other 9 leading causes is due to this hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance condition? What percent of healthcare is a result of that burden? What are the potential emissions reductions if these burdens could be lifted? And again, we're only talking environmental here. We have to also consider the societal and the economic. Sometimes I can't resist. Both professions wear white coats. Which profession produces more greenhouse gases? U.S. U.S. animal agriculture is 4%, beef alone is 2% of the total. U.S. healthcare has been estimated to be about 10%. So I want people to value their own health more. I want people to place greater importance on what they need to eat to improve their health than what somebody's telling them the impact of what they're eating will be on the world. Because when you improve your health, you are improving the world. Two resources I want people to be aware of so that they can learn more about a lot of what I've just blasted through. Animal Frontiers is an online, or it's available online. This particular edition was dedicated to foods of animal origin, a prescription for global health. And I recommend people read that to learn more. And then there's a remarkable resource online, Animal Source Foods in Ethical, Sustainable, and Healthy Diets. It's a dynamic white paper, so it's kept very, very current. There's over 24 scientists from around the world that are contributing to this effort. And being a white paper, you can read it at one level, but then there's the links to go deeper if that's what you'd like to do. Thank you for supporting Keto Salt Lake City. Hopefully we'll be able to get together soon in person, have an analog meeting, as it were. If you'd like to see more of me, and I can't imagine why that would be the case, but you can find me throughout social media. If you want to write me specifically, you can reach me at peter.ballerstedt@gmail.com. I have launched a sodcast. It's called Meet Your Herdmates. You can find that on YouTube as well as most podcast platforms. Nothing that I've said should be treated as medical advice because I'm not that kind of doctor, right? But Dr. Ballerstedt does recommend that you should be sure to take your daily meds, which stands for meat, eggs, dairy, and seafood. And a steak a day keeps the doctor away. Thank you.
That was awesome, Peter. Yeah, like I said before, one of the problems with watching these monologues is you don't get the interaction from the crowd, the gasps when it's like only 4% of the carb of the greenhouse gas emissions is from animal agriculture, and one thing I always really like about your presentations is you're very deliberate in what you're saying. You've got notes down below of all of the sources, and it's what you're saying shouldn't be inflammatory because you're being very cautious with what you say. But they are, what's the word I'm looking for? They're very, I guess, surprising statements for a lot of the population. Yeah. And I think it's just such a, well, and it keeps coming back to, we're not having an honest conversation when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions of livestock, when there's no talk about greenhouse gas emissions by people or pets. Okay. But when you were talking about, I can't remember which slide it was on, but when we're talking about the total greenhouse gas emissions of animal agriculture, and how reducing that would only drop it by a couple percentage, it still makes me wonder why that agenda is being so heavily pushed. Well, that's what it was. When you were talking about the burden of malnutrition on people in developing nations, and how the World Health Organization, and every time somebody says that, I say, who?
Yeah.
Sorry. That joke. When you have the same organization saying things about how, in order to have proper nutrition, animal sourced foods, to get specific, are required. And yet, you have other policymakers from the same organization saying we need to reduce animal foods and have more plant foods. Where is the disconnect?
Yeah, it's a fascinating issue. And even so, if you look up RDA, And I did this in the protein talk. It's referred to as reference protein. It's an amount of reference protein.
Okay.
Well, so somewhere else they define that as high quality. Somewhere else they define that as meat, eggs, dairy, seafood. But they don't do it up there. You got to
Really?
Yeah. And even those statements from WHO, the two
Nope.
that one report, yes. Those were footnotes at the bottom of the page.
Really? So
Yeah,
even
so
in
it's
that, oh wow.
and yeah, so it it's very much a third rail thing. People cannot hear what you say.
Don't touch the third rail. Don't touch it.
So it's like, okay, if we're going to talk about this, let's make sure we're talking about data. And, I'm reasonably certain that the estimates of methane are, you should pardon the expression, inflated, because those are based on assumed intakes, which are based on a percent of body weight. So now we have to have an assumed body weight for
Okay.
the assumed number of animals.
That's a lot of assumptions.
And we know that the methane that's produced is in part influenced by the quality of the diet.
Yes.
Not that, nope.
That's a lot of variables to make assumptions and policy about.
Yeah, absolutely. But people don't know that.
Okay.
So yeah, and like I say, if you go there,
Yeah.
then they're not going to hear anything else that you're saying.
Okay. Because at that point, they're not taking. Well, and I
You're a
remember.
denialist.
Yeah, I remember. Now, going along with this, I remember one of the things that you said, that you wanted to kind of build a bridge between the tribe of agriculture that you're familiar with and the tribe of keto and low carb that you're familiar with, so that people in the keto space, for instance, don't say something really stupid that makes it so that the people in the agricultural space go, wait, what? That's not true. Where did you learn that? Because that's not true. And then they just shut off and they stop listening to the message about eating correctly. So
Yeah. But
Anyway.
also, I just don't want people to make this more complicated than they have to, right?
yeah,
Yeah, so go to Safeway, buy what you can afford and you like eating, right?
yeah,
And sort it, right? It's not that difficult.
cast iron pan, a bunch of ground beef sounds good to me.
Yeah.
I'll
yeah,
even throw
exactly.
some spices in there, make taco meat. Okay.
Well, right, exactly. I've gotten really lazy. It's like I buy the salsa. And I
Okay.
throw that, and then we have a pan of ground meat, beef.
Yeah.
And so I'll put some of that in the bowl and I'll nuke it for 40 some seconds. And then I'll throw in some salsa and I'll nuke it again and I'll throw some cheese on top and
Yeah.
I'll go, or eggs, whatever.
We call that taco guts, by the way. You with a
Nice.
spoon.
Gosh, that's just some quality parenting there. That's prize winning.
Hey,